our actions have consequences. And this is something that is really important to understand. All throughout Judges, we have seen that vows, reactions, and a panic-made decision can trap everyone, the entire community, in grief. And this is exactly what happens when you see justice happening without any wisdom, and we see that the survivors of this can actually inherit the wreckage of our sin. And in Judges chapter 21, the final chapter of Judges, we're going to unpack Israel's remorse over Benjamin, the terrible scramble to preserve the tribe, the stolen daughters of Shiloh, and the book's final cry of moral chaos. And I'll give you one immediate action to help you deal with the consequences without creating new harm in this episode of Biblical Unlocks. This show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps you out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get a little bit of context into the chapter. So, Judges chapter 21 closes the book with grief, oaths, and desperate repairs. Israel mourns that Benjamin is almost wiped out, then tries to preserve the tribe by finding wives for the surviving men. And since they have sworn not to give their daughters to Benjamin, they end up compounding tragedy through violence at Jabesh Gilead. And then through the abduction of young women from Shiloh. The final verse sums up the whole book. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So the chapter is not a solution, it is actually a funeral for a fractured society. Okay, so let's read the first 4 verses. Israel is going to mourn over the fact that Benjamin was nearly destroyed. And my question for you is, why does the chapter begin with grief after victory? Verse 1, Now the Israelites had sworn at Mizpah, No one of us shall give his daughter in marriage to Benjamin. And the people came to Bethel and sat there until evening before God, and they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. They said, O Lord, the God of Israel, why has it come to pass that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel? On the next day, the people got up early and built an altar there and offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of well-being. Okay, so why do we open the chapter in this way? The reason is because victory has turned into sorrow, because Israel finally realizes, oh, maybe we shouldn't wipe out one of the tribes of Israel. And their grief is actually, I don't think it's fake, okay? I think they're genuinely devastated by what their own justice, which is not tied to holiness, not tied to the Lord, has done. And so the chapter actually begins by slowing down the emotional sort of tone so that we feel that winning a war is not actually going to heal a nation, and that we see that the truthful response is that sin's consequences are visible, and even though you're right, look at the consequences of your own actions. So Israel worries about this one tribe because, again, that covenant body can easily lose a tribe, and then it loses something of itself, and that is what is important here. They want justice, but justice can have severe ramifications if it's not pursued in the correct way. Okay, let's read verses 5 to 15 now. The focus here is going to be Jabesh Gilead being judged, and wives are sought for Benjamin. And my question for you is, why does trying to fix one tragedy create another? Verse 5. Then the Israelites said, Who out of all the tribes of Israel did not come up in the assembly to the Lord? For a solemn oath had been taken concerning whoever did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah, saying that one shall be put to death. But the Israelites had compassion for Benjamin, their kin, and said, One tribe is cut off from Israel this day. What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them any of our daughters as wives? Then they said, Is there anyone from the tribes of Israel who did not come up to the Lord to Mizpah? It turned out that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp to the assembly, for when the roll was called among the people, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead was there. So the congregation sent 12,000 soldiers there and commanded them, Go, put the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead to the sword, including the women and the little ones. This is what you shall do. Every male, every woman who has lain with a man you shall devote to destruction. And they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had never slept with a man, and brought them to the camp at Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. Then the whole congregation sent word to the Benjaminites, who were at the rock of Rimmon, and proclaimed peace to them. Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women whom they had saved alive of the women of Jabesh Gilead, but they did not suffice for them. The people had compassion on Benjamin because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. All right, let's go through those 10 verses. So first and foremost, we see that Israel, they attack Jabesh Gilead. And the reason is because they had sworn that anyone who did not come to the assembly should be put to death. And Jabesh Gilead, they didn't appear. And the problem is that this act of oath-keeping is now being used to solve another oath they made, right? So what we're seeing is there's violence which is being compounded on violence. People are seeking justice for themselves, but doing so in a way that is completely detached from the covenant. So again, people can become trapped by their own words. So again, you having that religious devotion, but if it's without wisdom, it can multiply harm. So again, justice and vows, they need discernment. And we see that the men of Jabesh Gilead, they're killed, and the women are taken. So again, this is one of the more troubling parts of this book, and we're not celebrating it. We're actually going to show something, which is the moral depravity and the dehumanization that Israel participates in. So they're trying to keep Benjamin alive, and they're not technically breaking their oath, but the chapter is showing us something, that even though you're being sort of like clever in your own eyes, even though you're being righteous in your own eyes, that is not moral, okay? So we're seeing the moral collapse of Israel in this particular instance, because people are trying to preserve order, but they're destroying people. And that solutions, where have we heard that before? Solutions can actually become crimes when we ignore human dignity. What did we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27? That all people are created in the image of God. Male and female, he created them. So when we reduce people to we reduce or take away their human dignity, we take away their God-given value, this is what happens, okay? So it all comes down to that very important precept that we learn, that all people are created in the image of God. Okay, let's read verses 16 to 25. The focus here is going to be the women of Shiloh. They're taken so Benjamin can survive. And my question to you is, why do we see such a desperate solution become morally horrifying? And the final verse of the chapter, I want you to pay very close attention. Verse 25, okay? So let's take a look and read. Verse 16. So the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since there are no women left in Benjamin?" And they said, "There must be heirs for the survivors of Benjamin, in order that a tribe may not be blotted out of Israel. Yet we cannot give any of our daughters to them as wives, for the Israelites had sworn, 'Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to Benjamin.' So they said, 'Look, the yearly festival of the Lord is taking place at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebanon.' And they instructed the Benjaminites, saying, 'Go and lie in wait in the vineyards, and watch when the young women of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances. Then come out of the vineyards, and each of you carry off a wife for himself from the young women of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. Then if their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, Be generous and allow us to have them, because we did not capture in battle a wife for each man, but neither did you incur guilt by giving your daughters to them.' The Benjaminites did so. They took wives for each of them from the dancers whom they abducted. Then they went and returned to their territory and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. So the Israelites departed from there at that time by the tribes and families, and they went out from there to their own territories." Verse 25. "In those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes." And that is the end of Judges. It's been a long time, 21 days we've gone through this, 3 weeks, and what have we learned? I think it can be best summarized in that final verse. But before we go into that, let's talk about verses 16 to 24. So the chapter actually becomes quite horrifying here, because we see a kidnapping strategy disguised as a survival plan. So the men of Benjamin are told to seize women at the festival of Shiloh, and the whole thing is rationalized as a workaround. And this is trying to show us something. The people have become so deeply disordered. The nation is trying to preserve itself by violating the very people who should have been protected. That is the problem. There are monstrous fixes that are being employed here. And this is something that we need to really pay close attention to. How drastic the situation has become, that they are resorting to kidnapping. They're resorting to completely denigrating the image of God here, because of some sort of pious regime in some sense. They're trying to enact their own purposes in their own sense without actually bringing it to the Word of God. And this is sad because the violation happens in a place and moment of worship and communal joy. And that's actually what makes it even more corrupt, because this is meant to be a festival, and yet the holy celebration actually becomes a setting for coercion. So that is showing how the covenant life can collapse and even become twisted. So, what are we meant to learn from this? What are we meant to learn from this? That the book has a particular line that is repeated, right? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What does that mean? Is that freedom? No, it's chaos. In fact, that is the thing. We have free will, but oftentimes we actually need to give that free will back to God. We need to stop trying to make everything about ourselves and stop trying to take everything into our own hands, because the final verse actually leaves the readers, it leaves us with a longing for a king who can order justice without destroying the people. Disordered societies that we're seeing here, the disordered society that we're seeing in Israel, right? It shows us something, that this entire book has been a descent into moral confusion, and Judges chapter 21 doesn't actually resolve the problem. No, it shows we need a true king, a true covenant, and a people whose justice does not devour the vulnerable, and that is the king that we are awaiting for. So let's see how this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ. Judges chapter 21 closes with the collapse of a society that cannot heal its own wounds without creating new ones. And in Christ, the answer is not some other impoverished fix, but he is the true king, whose rule, it does not exploit the weak, and whose justice, it never becomes cruelty, because he is the one who restores what is broken. And he doesn't turn people into tools for his own advantage. Instead, he gathers people who are scattered without doing violence to the image of God within them, as we read in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 to 27. And what does he say in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28? One of the most beautiful verses in the entire New Testament. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." And what's interesting, we also read this in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12. There is a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death, right? We can take things into our own hand. We can say, you know what, I'm going to take everything into my own hands. I'm going to live life the way I want to. But guess what? That leads to destruction, sadness, and loss. But we rest in the King who heals all things without harming, and that is Jesus Christ. Alright, so how can we apply this chapter in our everyday life? The biggest thing, I think, is that when we face bad decisions, we shouldn't just ask, like, how can I fix this, you know? How can I fix this? It's more, how can I let God enter into my situation? How can I allow God to dictate the sort of plan that I'm going to have here? And the reason why I'm saying this is because the Israelites were trying to solve their situation. They were trying to solve their problems, but they were failing miserably because their solutions were actually detrimental to the covenant. They never allowed God to act in their society. And because of that, we saw the destruction. We need to let Jesus sort of take the wheel, in a sense, and take control over our actions. Alright, so that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. We learned in this episode that Israel's grief over Benjamin shows that victory can leave deep wounds. The attempt to preserve Benjamin actually creates new sins, because oath-keeping without wisdom actually became destructive. We saw that the final verse diagnoses the whole book. No king, no true order, and everyone does what is right in his own eyes. Remember, there is a way which seems right to a man, but at its end is the way of death. So, Judges, what does it help us do? What does it show us at the end? We long for righteous leadership and a deeper form of redemption. If we do everything in our own way, if we try and seek glory for ourselves, if we try and put everything on our own shoulders, this is the result: death and destruction. Judges chapter 21 is summarized in the final verse of the chapter, and we need to remember that in our own lives. So, that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps me out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.